The Georgia sun beat down on Fort Benning, casting sharp shadows across the training grounds. Dust swirled lazily with each passing breeze, settling on the boots of young recruits lined up along the firing range. The air smelled of sweat, metal, and gunpowder, an unmistakable perfume of the military life. It was the kind of day where tempers ran short, but drills continued relentlessly. Colonel Robert, a decorated officer with more than 3 decades in uniform, strode across the range with an air of authority that silenced chatter in his wake. He carried himself like a man who had seen and done it all: combat deployments, leadership roles, and countless hours shaping the next generation of soldiers. His voice carried power, his laugh could command a room, and his judgment was rarely questioned. That was until today. At the far end of the range knelt Sergeant Ward, carefully preparing her M24 sniper rifle. Her uniform was crisp but plain, her hair tucked neatly under her cap, her expression composed. She was not flashy, nor did she seek attention. Yet attention always seemed to find her, though not for reasons she preferred. Her rifle, scuffed, with worn edges and scratches along the stock, stood in stark contrast to the polished gear many others flaunted. To the untrained eye, it looked old, maybe even cheap, as though it had seen better days and belonged on a rack in a pawn shop rather than in the hands of a U.S. Army sniper. Colonel stopped mid-stride, narrowing his eyes. Then, with a booming chuckle, he pointed directly at her weapon. "Ward," he barked, his grin spreading wide enough for nearby recruits to notice. "What in God's name is that thing? Did you pick it up from a garage sale on the way here?" The recruits erupted in laughter, nudging one another, some whispering insults that carried just loud enough for to hear. She didn't flinch. Her hands remained steady as she adjusted her scope, checked her bolt, and tested the bipod's stability. The comments rolled over her like water over stone. She had heard it all before: too young, too small, too quiet, too unremarkable to be trusted with the title of sharpshooter. And now, apparently, too foolish to carry what her colonel deemed an embarrassing weapon. Inside, though, she felt the familiar spark ignite. Mockery had long been her fuel. Colonel, still grinning, stepped closer. "You know, Ward, image matters in this business. A soldier ought to look sharp, professional. That rifle looks like a family heirloom someone forgot to throw out." More laughter. The colonel was good at commanding a crowd, and he knew it. He relished the way the recruits followed his lead, feeding his performance. Finally looked up. Her eyes met his, calm, unwavering, and colder than he expected. She didn't argue. She didn't smile. She simply held his gaze long enough for silence to ripple awkwardly through the group. Raised his brows, amused by her audacity, and let out another laugh. "What's the matter, Sergeant? Cat got your tongue? Or are you praying that relic can actually fire straight?" Still nothing. Lowered her head, refocused on her weapon, and finished her checks. To her, the rifle wasn't a relic. It was a trusted companion. Every scratch along its frame told a story: long nights of training, dusty deployments, endless hours perfecting the craft of precision shooting. The M24 wasn't about looks. It was about reliability. She knew its weight, its recoil, the subtle quirks that only thousands of rounds could reveal. While others relied on shiny new models to boost their confidence, relied on familiarity and discipline. But she also knew something else. Wasn't mocking her rifle. He was mocking her. That was the part she couldn't ignore. "Tell you what," the colonel said suddenly, his grin returning. He turned to the recruits, raising his voice. "Why don't we give our sergeant here a chance to prove us all wrong? What do you say, soldiers?" The group cheered, some clapping, others whistling. A few smirked knowingly, expecting an easy humiliation. Pointed downrange. "Set up a target, let's make it interesting." Within minutes, a red balloon swayed faintly 1,000 yards away, nearly invisible in the shimmering heat. The challenge drew murmurs from the recruits. That distance was no joke, even for experienced snipers. The colonel folded his arms, his grin wide. "All right, Ward, Show us what that yard sale rifle can do. Lowered herself to the ground, body moving into position with practiced grace. She adjusted her scope, ignoring the muttering behind her. The heat, the laughter, the colonel's mocking tone, all of it faded. Her world narrowed to the weight of the rifle against her shoulder, the smooth feel of the trigger beneath her finger, the rise and fall of her own breathing. She inhaled slowly, exhaled even slower. Her finger tightened. The shot cracked across the range, echoing against the trees. A heartbeat later, the balloon popped. The range fell silent. Rose calmly, brushing dust from her sleeves. She didn't look at the colonel. She didn't acknowledge the recruits. She didn't smile. Her rifle hung at her side, unassuming and quiet just as she was. But the silence that followed was deafening. For the first time that day, Colonel's laugh had died in his throat. The echo of the shot still lingered when the balloon fragments fluttered like scarlet confetti against the pale Georgia sky. Recruits stood frozen, eyes wide, mouths half open. Some blinked rapidly as if their vision had deceived them. 1,000 yards was no small feat. Even seasoned marksmen struggled under such conditions. Yet Sergeant Ward had ended the challenge in less than a heartbeat. Colonel's grin slipped into something far less certain. His chest puffed slightly as though to recover lost ground, but the corners of his mouth twitched with restrained disbelief. He hadn't expected her to land it, not with that battered rifle, not under the gaze of the entire range. "Beginner's luck," he muttered, loud enough for the nearest recruits to hear. They chuckled, though softer this time. The laughter lacked conviction. There was an edge to the silence now, a shift in the air that no one could quite deny. Said nothing. She calmly engaged the safety, set the rifle down, and knelt with quiet composure. The sun glinted across her scope, its scratches catching the light like battle scars. She appeared as if she hadn't done anything extraordinary at all. But wasn't about to let her walk away with that kind of unspoken victory. His pride, hard forged through decades of service, was not so easily disarmed. "Let's not get carried away," he barked, stepping forward. "One shot doesn't make a sniper. War isn't won by lucky breaks." His voice rang sharp, restoring a measure of control over the recruits. They straightened, waiting for what came next. Waved his hand toward the range. "Set new targets. I want silhouettes moving. Stagger the distances." The soldiers hurried to obey, dragging heavy metal frames into position. Targets rolled forward and back, jerking unpredictably across the expanse of the field. The challenge escalated quickly. No balloons, no gimmicks, just raw marksmanship under pressure. Turned back to, his eyes narrowing. "You want to prove that rifle of yours is worth carrying. Hit every one of them, and do it fast." The murmurs rose again. Recruits leaned toward one another, whispering. Some smirked, expecting her streak to end. Moving targets were the true test. Stationary balloons were one thing, but tracking unpredictable silhouettes at varying distances required more than luck. It demanded skill, instinct, and nerves of steel. Didn't argue. She simply dropped into prone position, checked her scope, and steadied her breathing. Her heart didn't race. It slowed, as it always did when the rifle pressed against her shoulder. The world shrank again. Less noise, less distraction, less ego. Just the rhythm she had lived by for years. Breathe, squeeze, follow through. The first silhouette moved at 300 yards. Crack. Dust puffed from its chest and it collapsed. The second darted at 500 yards. Crack. It fell lifeless. Gasps escaped the crowd. She moved seamlessly from target to target, her rifle bucking softly, each recoil absorbed like muscle memory. Crack, crack, crack. The cadence became hypnotic. Her hands didn't tremble. Her eyes didn't waver. She anticipated movement before it happened, reading the slight jerks of the silhouettes as though she had rehearsed this moment countless times. One by one the targets dropped, each hit clean, centered. By the time silence settled again, every silhouette lay downrange with a perfect bullet mark punched dead through the chest. The recruits erupted, not in laughter but in stunned murmurs. Some shook their heads, others let out low whistles of awe. The woman they had expected to fail had turned the firing range into a stage, and they were watching a performance unlike any they'd ever seen. Colonel stood motionless, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His eyes flickered with something rare, hesitation. For years he had commanded respect effortlessly, his authority unchallenged. Yet here, before his recruits, a quiet sergeant with a so-called cheap rifle had shaken the foundation of his certainty. Still, he wasn't ready to concede, not yet. "Impressive," he said finally, his tone clipped. "But marksmanship isn't just about hitting paper and steel. Real combat is unpredictable." His words fell flat, lacking their usual confidence. The recruits weren't listening anymore. Their eyes stayed fixed on the soldier who had just redefined the limits of the range. Herself remained silent as she always did. She rose slowly, dusted her uniform, and retrieved her rifle. She didn't celebrate, didn't gloat, didn't even glance toward. The lack of reaction only deepened the impression. She didn't need their approval. She knew what she was capable of, and that was enough. The silence grew heavier with every passing second, cleared his throat, straightening. "Tomorrow we push further," he announced, his voice echoing. "This isn't over." The recruits snapped back to attention, but their expressions betrayed them. Respect, genuine respect, had already shifted away from the colonel's booming authority to the quiet sharpshooter who had said nothing at all. As the crowd dispersed, whispers rippled through the ranks. "Did you see that grouping?" one murmured. "She didn't miss a single one. That old rifle, she made it look like magic." Walked past them, her boots crunching over gravel. She heard every word but kept her eyes forward. For her, this wasn't about proving herself to them or to the colonel. It was about proving, once again, that precision lived within discipline, not appearances. Behind her stood alone at the range, his jaw set, his pride wounded. But in the pit of his chest, a small, unwelcome truth gnawed at him. The sergeant he had mocked might very well be better than he had ever imagined. The training field felt heavier after Sergeant Ward's flawless demonstration. Dust hung in the air, shimmering in the heat, as if the very ground recognized something remarkable had happened. Recruits who once smirked at her pawn-shop relic now whispered among themselves, replaying each impossible shot in their minds. The silence of disbelief had given way to murmurs of awe. Colonel Robert, however, refused to yield. Pride was a stubborn thing, forged by decades of command and hardened by medals pinned across his chest. He would not, could not, allow one sergeant with a battered M24 to upend his authority. He stepped forward with sharp precision, his boots striking the gravel like hammers. "Don't fool yourselves," he barked, his voice carrying across the stunned recruits. "Any soldier can have a lucky day. 1,000 yards is impressive, sure, but luck fades when conditions change." His words carried power, but this time the recruits' eyes didn't follow him. They followed her. That subtle shift burned more deeply than he admitted. Turning toward his staff, he motioned briskly. "Reset the field. New challenge. I want staggered targets, random patterns, unpredictable movement." Soldiers rushed to obey. Heavy silhouettes were rolled back into position, some stationary, some mounted on tracks to dart side to side, mimicking combat unpredictability. Distances varied from 200 yards to beyond 800. The sun was sinking slightly, casting sharper shadows, making visibility even harder. Folded his arms, his eyes locked on. "Let's see if you can handle this. One target's one thing. Real battlefields don't sit still." The recruits muttered again, uncertain. Many nodded this was true. Still, after her earlier display, some carried quiet hope she'd pull it off again. Didn't argue. She never did. Instead, she lay prone, sliding smoothly into position, her movements practiced and calm. She adjusted her scope, checked her windage, and pressed her cheek against the worn stock of her rifle. Her heart slowed. The chatter behind her disappeared. The world shrank until it was only her, the rifle, and the shifting silhouettes. Crack, the first target dropped center mass. Crack, the second fell mid-step, collapsing like a puppet with strings cut. Crack, the third, darting erratically, toppled with a neat hole through its chest. The cadence of her shots became a rhythm, steady and deliberate. She didn't rush, didn't panic. She tracked each target with patience, anticipating movement before it happened. Her discipline was visible even to the untrained eye: breath in, breath out, squeeze. Dust clouds puffed one after another as silhouettes fell across the range. Recruits gasped. Some clapped hands over their mouths. Others muttered "no way" under their breath. The impossible was unfolding before them. Wasn't just hitting targets. She was dismantling the entire challenge with surgical precision. When the last target dropped, the silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind seemed to pause. Remained still, her cheek resting against the rifle, eyes steady through the scope. Only when the last echo faded did she rise, smooth and unhurried. She engaged the safety, gathered her gear, and stood. Every silhouette lay fallen, each marked with near-perfect accuracy. The recruits erupted, not in laughter but in stunned applause and whistles. Respect flooded the air. Soldiers who had mocked her hours earlier now looked at her with awe, their earlier arrogance replaced by genuine admiration. Colonel's jaw tightened. He clenched his fists behind his back, forcing his face into a mask of stoicism. Inside, however, a storm raged. He had expected mistakes. A flinch, a missed shot, something, anything, that would prove her earlier success had been chance. But what he had witnessed wasn't luck. It was mastery. Still, he refused to let her win. "Impressive," he said finally, his tone clipped. "But war isn't about pretty groupings on steel. Real enemies shoot back. Real chaos doesn't give you perfect conditions." The recruits barely listened. Their heads turned toward, their eyes wide with admiration. Respect, something had commanded without question, was slipping from his grasp and transferring to her, silently but undeniably. True to form, said nothing. She didn't gloat. She didn't argue. She simply brushed the dust from her uniform and slung her rifle over her shoulder. The very act of saying nothing seemed louder than any retort. Cleared his throat, raising his voice to reclaim authority. "Tomorrow, we'll push this further. Don't think today's tricks will carry you forever." The recruits nodded, though half-heartedly. Some exchanged glances and caught them. The glances stung more than he admitted. Walked past them, her boots crunching softly over gravel. She carried herself without arrogance, her steps measured and silent. Yet every recruit tracked her as she passed, the air thick with something new: respect, admiration, and maybe even inspiration. As the crowd dispersed, lingered alone at the edge of the range. He stared at the fallen silhouettes, each with bullet holes punched neatly through the chest. For the first time in years, he felt unsettled. This wasn't just skill, this wasn't just training. This was something rarer, something he couldn't yet name, but something he knew he could no longer ignore. He had laughed at her once. Now the laughter was gone, replaced by a quiet, gnawing thought that unsettled him more than any enemy ever had. What if Sergeant Ward wasn't just good? What if she was better than him? The recruits were still buzzing when the last target dropped. The whispers rippled across the range like wildfire. She didn't miss once. For many of them, the lesson of the day wasn't about rifles or scopes. It was about underestimation. They had laughed at Sergeant Ward hours ago. Now, not one dared meet her eye without a trace of respect. But Colonel stood rigid, his jaw tense, his pride wounded. 30 years of service had taught him many things, but humility had never been one of them. He had commanded combat units, drilled hardened soldiers, and tested marksmen from across the country. Yet none of them, not one, had dismantled his authority with such quiet efficiency. He refused to surrender ground. "Reset the field," ordered sharply, his voice slicing through the murmurs. This time we're going long. Recruits stiffened. They knew what that meant. Long-range shots were the holy grail of sniping, where wind, heat, and even the curvature of the earth began to play tricks on bullets. Wasn't talking about the respectable 1,000-yard shots they'd just seen. He was talking about the monster. 1,500 yards, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The range went silent. 1,500 yards, nearly a mile. For most shooters, it was a near-impossible feat, reserved for legends or luck. Many snipers never hit it in training, let alone under pressure. His grin returned, though this time, tinged with desperation. Let's see if that old rifle of yours can handle a real test. Soldiers moved quickly, hauling a heavy steel plate to the farthest section of the field. The afternoon sun shimmered, warping the distance into a mirage. Through the naked eye, the plate was little more than a dot glinting faintly against the horizon. The recruits shook their heads, exchanging skeptical glances. No way she makes that. Even misses at 1,500. This'll end it for her. The colonel drank in their words like fuel. He needed this. Needed her to fail. His pride, his authority, his reputation, it all demanded it. However, betrayed no sign of doubt. She lowered herself to the ground, body aligning with her rifle in a fluid, practiced motion. The M24 settled into the dirt, its bipod sinking slightly under her steady hands. She adjusted her scope with calm precision, her face serene. For her, distance was not intimidation, it was mathematics. She read the wind as it brushed against her cheek, subtle shifts whispering like an old language only she could understand. She watched the mirage, gauging how heat bent the air. She felt the earth beneath her, grounding her body in perfect stillness. Every factor was an equation, and she had solved them all before. Behind her, recruits leaned forward, straining to catch every movement. Crossed his arms, forcing his face into a mask of superiority he didn't fully feel. The world shrank again for 1,500 yards of space, compressed into the circle of her scope. She inhaled slowly, held, exhaled. Her finger squeezed. The crack tore across the range, echoing into the distance. Seconds stretched long, heavy with anticipation. Then, ping! The metallic ring echoed faint but unmistakable. Dead center. The range erupted. Gasps. Shouts. Some recruits clapped their hands over their mouths in disbelief. Others let out cheers they quickly tried to stifle under's glare. The colonel froze. His eyes widened before he could stop them, the shock betraying him. Through his binoculars, he confirmed what he didn't want to see, a perfect strike in the center of the steel plate. Remained prone, calm as ever, eyes still on her scope. She didn't react, didn't boast, didn't so much as twitch. She simply released her breath, slid the bolt back with a click and reset her weapon. The recruits couldn't hold back anymore. Whistles pierced the air. Murmurs of unbelievable, legendary, impossible rippled through the crowd. Clenched his jaw so hard it ached. He tried to summon words, something sharp to cut through the reverence growing around her, but nothing came. The steel plate rang louder in their minds than anything he could say. She had beaten the range. And worse, she had beaten him. Yet didn't glance at him, didn't even acknowledge the shift. She stood, brushing the dust from her knees, rifle in hand. To her, it wasn't about or the recruits. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about the discipline she carried within herself, the relentless pursuit of perfection. That, more than the shot itself, unnerved the colonel. She hadn't just performed an extraordinary feat. She had done it without needing validation. The silence pressed heavy until finally forced his voice to rise above it. Enough for today, he barked, harsher than intended. Dismissed. The recruits obeyed, though their eyes lingered on as they filed out. Conversation sparked immediately, excitement spilling from their lips. The woman they had laughed at hours earlier had just performed the impossible, and every one of them knew they had witnessed history on that range. remained behind, his hands gripping the binoculars until his knuckles whitened. He stared at the steel plate glinting faintly in the distance, the dead center strike mocking him from 1,500 yards away. For the first time in years, the colonel felt the weight of something he couldn't outshout, outrank, or outmuscle. Humility. And it burned like fire in his chest. By the next morning, Fort Benning was alive with whispers. The range had become legend overnight. In the mess hall, over trays of powdered eggs and burnt coffee, soldiers leaned close to one another, retelling the story in hushed voices. She hit the plate at 1,500 like it was nothing. No scope upgrades, no fancy rig, just that beat-up M24. I swear's face turned pale. Each retelling grew sharper, the story spreading like wildfire through the barracks. Ward's name, once muttered with smirks and doubt, now carried weight. Respect had taken root. However, remained unchanged. She ate quietly, her tray neatly arranged, her focus on the meal. She didn't bask in the attention or deny it. The whispers rolled past her as though she were deaf to them. She had long ago learned not to seek approval. Respect earned through skill was enough. Yet felt the shift like a stone in his boot. Everywhere he walked, he caught fragments of conversation. Soldiers who once hung on his every word now spoke of her. Some recruits saluted him with the same formality, but he sensed their eyes drift elsewhere. Authority wasn't just commanded by rank, it was sustained by belief. And belief was slipping. That evening sat alone in his office, the blinds drawn against the amber glow of sunset. Reports lay open on his desk, but he couldn't focus on the words. Instead, his mind replayed the sound of that metallic ping at 1,500 yards. He clenched his fist, forcing himself to breathe evenly. She was good, no better than good. The admission tasted bitter. Pride fought against it, clawing for denial, yet the evidence was burned into him. The balloon, the silhouettes, the steel plate, all perfect. He couldn't dismiss it as luck anymore. But what unsettled him most wasn't just her accuracy. It was her composure. She hadn't gloated, hadn't smirked, hadn't shown even the smallest flicker of triumph. Soldiers with half her ability strutted after a good shot. She, on the other hand, seemed indifferent to praise or doubt. That calm unnerved him. It reminded him of something he had lost over the years. Discipline without ego, purpose without theatrics. The next morning entered the training yard earlier than usual. Recruits were already assembling for drills, but their eyes cut toward almost instinctively. She was setting up her rifle, checking her gear with the same quiet patience. No audience, no performance, just preparation. The colonel cleared his throat, his presence drawing the usual silence. But today the air felt different. Less reverence, more curiosity. He barked orders, his voice carrying, but noticed the soldier's gaze flicker toward Ward again. Pride stung him sharper than before. He decided to test her differently, not with distance or moving targets, but with unpredictability. Real combat wasn't neat after all. Real combat was messy, chaotic, merciless. Later that week, staged an impromptu drill under conditions designed to rattle even the best. Sudden changes of wind, multiple shooters firing simultaneously, targets placed without warning. The night air was thick, the range bathed in artificial light that cast harsh shadows. One by one, soldiers failed to meet the mark. Some missed entirely, others hesitated under the pressure. Himself stepped up, determined to prove that chaos could level the field. His grouping was decent but scattered, the shots straying wide under the erratic conditions. Then took position. The recruits watched in silence as she dropped prone, her body aligning as if the chaos around her were irrelevant. Shots rang out, crisp and deliberate. Each target fell, some close, some distant, some nearly hidden in the shadows. Her grouping remained tight, precise, even under the manufactured stress. The silence afterward was heavier than ever. Didn't need binoculars to know the truth. She had outshot him, even under conditions designed to break her rhythm. Recruits whispered again, but not with disbelief this time, with admiration. They weren't just impressed, they were inspired. In the mess hall the next day, the story spread further. Soldiers from other units stopped to listen, their curiosity piqued. Ward, the quiet sergeant with the old rifle, had once again proved the impossible possible. Sat at a corner table, his fork untouched on his tray, listening. He felt something stir in him, something he hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not resentment, something harder to admit. Respect. He hated how grudgingly it came, but it was there all the same. For the first time, began to wonder if the ridicule he had hurled at her rifle, her skill, her quiet demeanor had been more about protecting his pride than testing her mettle. The realization gnawed at him. Recruits still obeyed him, still respected his rank, but the awe, the spark in their eyes, no longer belonged to him. It belonged to her. And deep down, despite the sting of pride, knew why. She had shown them what true mastery looked like, not loud, not boastful, not demanding, just quiet, steady excellence. And excellence, realized, was something no rank could mock into silence. The night sky hung heavy over Fort Benning, streaked with low clouds that swallowed the moon. Floodlights illuminated the range in harsh white cones, but beyond them stretched darkness, thick, unpredictable, and unforgiving. Colonel had ordered the drill himself, determined to reassert his command. It wasn't about long-range precision this time. It was about survival, reaction, and teamwork under simulated combat conditions. Targets would appear randomly, some moving, some stationary, some hidden among obstacles. Shooters would move through the course together, their success measured not only by accuracy but by coordination. And tonight chose to pair himself with Sergeant Ward. Recruits buzzed as word spread. The colonel and the sergeant side by side, it was unprecedented. Some expected fireworks, others humiliation. Few could predict what would actually unfold. When strode onto the range, his posture was as rigid as ever, but his eyes betrayed the storm within. He carried his service rifle, polished and immaculate, every part tuned to his preference. Walked beside him, M24 slung across her shoulder, her calm presence unshaken by the weight of the spectacle. Rules are simple, barked. Clear the course, fast, precise, no excuses. The buzzer blared. They moved. The first target popped from the shadows, a half-silhouette swinging from left to right. Fired first, his shot cracking through the night. He clipped the edge good enough for a hit, but sloppy. Followed a breath later. Her round struck dead center, the steel plate clanging with authority. Another target rose, two this time, one near, one far. Pivoted to the closer, squeezing his trigger in haste. The round sailed wide. He cursed under his breath, fumbling for correction. Already aligned, dropped the distant target cleanly before turning to strike the near one had missed. Both fell before could fire again. Recruits watching from the sidelines exchanged glances. They whispered, but the colonel didn't hear. His pulse thundered in his ears. "Move," he barked, charging ahead. They advanced down the gravel path, shadows shifting unpredictably. Pop-up targets leapt from behind barrels, windows, even the dirt. Fired aggressively, rounds scattering. Some connected, most didn't. Shots came measured, unhurried, each one deliberate, and every one struck home. Then came the chaos test. Dozens of targets sprang at once across a wide field. Froze for a fraction, overwhelmed. He tried to track too many at once, firing blindly, his grouping dissolving into noise. Dropped to one knee, steadying her rifle. Her scope swept, her trigger broke rhythmically. Ping, ping, ping. Targets dropped in sequence, her movements efficient and calm. Within seconds the field was cleared, every silhouette down. Silence fell except for the ringing steel. Lowered his rifle, chest heaving. Sweat trickled under his collar. For the first time in years, he felt outclassed. Not just by a recruit, not just by a peer, but by someone he had openly mocked. The realization pressed down on him heavier than any rank or burden of command. Course complete. the range officer called over the loudspeaker. The recruits erupted in hushed chatter, stood stiff, fighting to keep his expression neutral, rose smoothly, dust clinging to her fatigues, her rifle resting easily in her hands. She didn't look at him, didn't gloat, didn't so much as smirk. That indifference cut deeper than any boast could. Walking back toward the barracks, thoughts tangled. For decades he had measured himself as the standard, unyielding, uncompromising, untouchable. Yet tonight, shoulder to shoulder with her, he had faltered while she excelled. What unsettled him most wasn't losing. It was realizing how far he had drifted from the heart of soldiering. He remembered his early years, the hunger, the discipline, the endless nights on the range. Back then, pride hadn't driven him. Purpose had. But somewhere along the way, he had traded that purpose for position, believing rank alone proved his worth. Ward had reminded him otherwise. Later that night in his office, poured himself a drink he didn't touch. He stared at the M24 specifications on a printout, recalling the way she had handled it. That rifle wasn't cheap, as he had sneered. It was reliable, time-tested, and in the right hands, her hands, deadly beyond imagination. He leaned back, the chair creaking. For the first time, he felt the crack in his armor of arrogance. The colonel who had laughed at a rifle now sat silent, humbled by the soldier who carried it. Meanwhile, outside in the barracks, recruits replayed the drill in their minds, their admiration for deepening. She wasn't just a skilled shooter anymore, she was becoming a symbol. Quiet, relentless, and unshakable. And as lay awake in his quarters, staring at the ceiling, one truth gnawed at him. Leadership wasn't about demanding respect. It was about earning it. And tonight, Sergeant Ward had earned more than he had in years. The morning after the night drill, the base felt different. Not louder, not busier, but charged, as if everyone carried a secret they couldn't stop thinking about. Recruits whispered in corners, sergeants exchanged knowing looks, and even seasoned officers admitted in low tones that Sergeant Ward had put on a performance few could match. But for Colonel, the weight of that night lingered heavier than any rumor. He had seen it with his own eyes, how she steadied under chaos while he faltered, how every shot of hers carved truth into steel. No amount of authority could erase that. He had avoided her all morning, burying himself in paperwork that blurred into nonsense. But avoidance wasn't strength. Avoidance was weakness, and had built his reputation on being anything but weak. By midday, he made his decision. The training yard was quiet, the recruits gone for lunch. Ward stood at one end, her M24 disassembled on a bench, every piece laid out with surgical precision. She moved methodically, wiping each part with cloth, her focus complete. Approached, his boots crunching over gravel. She didn't look up. "Sergeant Ward," he said, his tone clipped. "Colonel." Her voice was even, neutral, acknowledging him without deference or hostility. For a moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint scrape of metal as she cleaned her rifle. "You've made an impression," finally said. "The recruits talk about you as if you're untouchable." She paused, sliding the bolt assembly into place, then continued without answering. "That shot at 1500, he pressed. "The way you handled the chaos drill, you've left a mark." At last she looked up, her steady eyes meeting his. "With respect, sir, it's not about marks, it's about doing the job." Her words cut sharper than he expected. No arrogance, no dismissal, just clarity. Cleared his throat, shifting his stance. "You think I was wrong to challenge you?" Didn't answer immediately. She secured the rifle's stock before speaking. "You weren't wrong, Colonel. Tests make us better. But laughter, doubt, that doesn't sharpen anyone, it dulls the blade." The truth of it struck him like recoil. He thought back to the way he'd sneered at her rifle, the way the recruits had laughed with him, emboldened by his authority. He hadn't sharpened her. She had sharpened herself, despite him. "Do you know why I pushed so hard?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Shook her head. "Because I saw something in you I didn't want to admit," he said. The words tasted bitter but also cleansing. Skill, control, discipline. The kind I used to have before rank and time stripped it away. She studied him, expression unreadable, and now. Exhaled long and heavy. Now I see it's still possible. You reminded me what it looks like. For the first time in weeks, a flicker of vulnerability crossed his face. It wasn't easy to bear, but the weight of denial had become too much to carry. Didn't soften, but her voice carried something steadier than before. Respect isn't about rank, Colonel. You taught us that, even if you didn't mean to. Out there, the steel doesn't care what's on your collar. It only answers to skill. He almost smiled, and the recruits. They saw the same thing you did, she said simply. Truth rings louder than orders. The colonel's jaw tightened, then relaxed. He had spent years building walls of pride, but here, in front of a sergeant with an old rifle, those walls crumbled. For a long moment they stood in silence. Him, the career officer learning humility too late. Her, the quiet marksman who had proven herself without seeking recognition. Finally nodded once. You've earned more than their respect, Sergeant. You've earned mine. Inclined her head, not in triumph but acknowledgement. That's all any of us can hope for, sir. To do the job well enough that it speaks louder than we ever could. Turned, his boots crunching again on the gravel as he walked away. He felt lighter somehow, though the sting of humility still burned. Behind him, resumed cleaning her rifle, her focus returning to the task as if nothing had changed. And perhaps for her, nothing had. She hadn't sought this confrontation, hadn't needed his respect to validate her. She had only needed her rifle, her discipline, and the truth of her shots. But for everything had changed. That night he sat alone in his quarters, staring at his medals on the wall. They gleamed under the dim light, reminders of battles fought, commands given, victories claimed. Yet none of them felt as sharp, as true, as the lesson he had received from one sergeant with one rifle. Leadership wasn't about the medals or the collar. It was about seeing truth, even when it humbled you. And as he finally drifted to sleep, knew he would never laugh at another soldier's weapon again. The weeks after the confrontation brought a noticeable shift across Fort Benning. Training drills no longer carried the same undercurrent of mockery or competition. They carried focus. Recruits who once strutted with bravado now spent hours refining their form, measuring wind, adjusting for distance with patience they had never known before. They were imitating Ward. Her influence spread without speeches or lectures. She didn't demand their respect, didn't seek their attention. She simply showed up, day after day, rifle in hand, discipline in her bones. The recruits watched, learned, and quietly began to shape themselves in her image. The colonel noticed it too. Stood on the edge of the range one afternoon, arms crossed, observing a line of shooters. Their grouping had improved dramatically in only a matter of weeks. More importantly, their mindset had shifted. They were steadier, less eager to show off, more willing to learn. When he asked one recruit what had changed, the young man had shrugged and said, "We just figured if Sergeant Ward can make the impossible look simple, the least we can do is stop wasting shots." Didn't argue. He only nodded, though inside he felt the echo of something unfamiliar. Not resentment, not envy. Pride, genuine pride, not the brittle kind he had clung to before. That evening he called a meeting with his junior officers. His voice carried the same authority as always, but his words carried something new. "From now on," told them, "we train harder, we train smarter. Rank doesn't exempt anyone from discipline. Not me, not you. If Sergeant Ward can show us excellence with an M24, then the rest of us have no excuse." The officers exchanged surprised glances, but none challenged him. They saw the truth in his eyes. The colonel had been humbled, and he had chosen to learn rather than resist. The next day did something no one expected. He walked onto the range carrying not his polished service rifle, but an M24 identical to. It felt foreign in his hands, heavier in memory than in weight. The recruits watched in stunned silence as their colonel, a man who had once mocked the rifle, set himself on the line beside them. He missed his first target, then his second. The murmurs grew but didn't flinch. He breathed, corrected, and fired again. Slowly his shots began to find the steel, not perfect, not elegant, but improving. And when he lowered the rifle, he didn't glare or scold. He simply nodded and said, "Every day is a chance to get sharper. Don't waste it." From the corner of the field, watched, her expression calm. She didn't smile, didn't gloat, but the faintest flicker of acknowledgement touched her eyes. The respect had finally become mutual. Weeks turned into months. Rumors of Sergeant Ward's feats continued to ripple beyond Fort Benning, reaching other bases, other units. Stories of her 1,500-yard shot and her composure under chaos became almost mythic, told around campfires and mess halls. Some exaggerated details, as stories always do, but the core remained true. She was the soldier who reminded them all what discipline looked like. Colonel, once the man who mocked her, became the one who defended her name when skeptics doubted. He never spoke of his humiliation, never recounted his own failures. But in his orders, in his training, and the way he carried himself, the change was visible. Humility had taken root. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the range emptied, approached once more. She was packing up her rifle, the same rifle he had once called cheap. "You've changed this place," he said quietly. Glanced at him. "I didn't set out to." "Doesn't matter, you did." He hesitated, then added, "You changed me too." For a man like, it was as close to confession as she would ever hear. She nodded, shouldering her rifle. "Then maybe we both did the job right, sir." They walked off the range together, the gravel crunching under their boots, not as adversaries, not even as superior and subordinate, but as soldiers bound by the same truth: respect wasn't demanded, it was earned. That night, under the dim light of his office, took out his journal, a habit he'd abandoned years ago. He wrote one line, deliberate and steady: "The steel only answers to skill." He closed the book, exhaled deeply, and for the first time in decades felt at peace with the man he was becoming. And across the base, recruits carried their rifles with new discipline, their sights steadier, their breaths calmer, their purpose sharper. The legend of Sergeant Ward wasn't just a story anymore. It was a standard. The colonel had laughed once. Now, like everyone else, he listened.